Dr Russell Norman.
Speaker. Mr Speaker, I rise to speak to Clause 2 of this bill, the Employment Relations Film Production Warner Brothers Amendment Bill. Now, this clause, I wish to make 2 points about the commencement clause, Clause 2. The first of which is the date at which the bill should become active. And, Mr Speaker, it seems to me that this bill should come into force on the 6th of February 1840. The reason for that is quite simple. The Treaty of Waitangi was an agreement between the Crown and tangata whenua, right, between iwi and the Crown. Now, if we are to say that the New Zealand Parliament is no longer sovereign, that the Crown is no longer represented, that the New Zealand Parliament doesn't decide laws, in fact it's Warner Brothers that decides laws, then why should the treaty be between iwi and the Crown when the Crown, the Democratic Parliament, has given up on the idea that it is sovereign? So it seems to me we should backdate the commencement to when the treaty was signed, and we should just say the treaty will now be active between tangata whenua and multinational corporations. It would simplify things if we made the commencement date 6th of February 1840 and we just got over this funny little interlude where we tried to establish a democratic parliament in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Because we went through this experiment to have democracy, and now the National Party's decided it's a bad idea. They'd rather have multinational corporations decide what the law is in New Zealand. So we should backdate the commencement of this Act back to the treaty so that it is a simple agreement between tangata whenua and multinational corporations, and we just avoid the whole experiment with democracy, because what National are saying to us tonight, and ACT and the Maori Party, is that this experiment where the Crown... this is attending to the commencement date, Mr Chair, to say that the commencement date should be 6th of February 1840, and the rationale for that is that the democratically elected Crown is no longer present. We now have...
The member is way off track. The relevance of that is not part of this debate. We're on the commencement. The member comes back to that, or I will terminate the speech.
So we're talking about Clause 2, Mr Chair, which is about the commencement date, and I am making a simple argument as to why the commencement date should in fact be the 6th of February 1840 because of the fact... Mr Chair, that's a simple...
I'm on my feet. Now, that is not a serious matter. 1840 is not a serious part of the debate. This is about relevance, and if the member doesn't come back to the commencement as the bill is presented, then I will terminate the speech. Dr Norman.
And so the previous speaker talked about retrospectivity in the discussion with regard to commencement date, but the Chair has said I cannot discuss retrospectivity because he doesn't like what I say about retrospectivity. Let me discuss another aspect of Clause 2. The other aspect of Clause 2 which is overlooked is the question of the royal assent. Because what people think Clause 2 is about is simply the commencement date. The other part of Clause 2 is the question of the royal assent. Now, my suggestion is we should get rid of this section which says it has to receive the royal assent, which is a part of Clause 2, and we should say it should simply have Warner Brothers' consent. It would be much simpler. We should say the bill comes into force, looking at Clause 2, Mr Chair, not when it receives royal assent, but when Warner Brothers approves the bill, because that is what the government is effectively saying. This bill, for the government is saying, my interpretation is that what they're really saying is that the commencement, Clause 2, which discusses when this bill comes into force, which is after it receives the royal assent, actually the National Party is saying it comes into force after Warner Brothers say that it is okay. So we should amend Clause 2, say instead of this bill comes into force on the day after it receives royal assent, instead say the bill comes into force the day after Warner Brothers say that it's okay. Once they give the tick to the National Party, we really like what you've written, National Party, they'll say, and we think that it can come into force now, rather than going through this Governor-General business and this democracy and this sovereignty, which is all a bit of a nuisance. When the Warner Brothers say it should come into force, which is what Clause 2 is all about, when it comes into force, instead of coming into force after it receives the royal assent, which is a bit of a hangover from the old days after all, it's a bit of that, the old Commonwealth and all of that, and we're all for moving on beyond the Queen and all that thing. Well, we'll move beyond the Queen. Instead of royal assent, it will be Warner Brothers' consent. We can achieve a republic and be a subservient to multinational corporations all at once. This is by a simple amendment to Clause 2, by replacing the word royal with Warner Brothers, a simple amendment to Clause 2, entirely within the scope of this debate. a very simple amendment to Clause 2. Instead of royal assent, which obviously the National Party don't like because they want to move beyond the monarchy, we want the National Party proposing actually it's when Warner Brothers give its consent, that's when the bill can come into force. And we can get over all this nonsense about the Queen and all of that business.